Okay guys, we'll get started because they're pretty quick with the bell and they're pretty strict with the timing. That starts us off. So as we crack into it, we'll start with just reminders that once this session is finished, we've got the AGM at 5 tonight, and to encourage you to go to that, the mix and mingle doesn't start till 6. The first chat this afternoon is from Ben, so I'll let him take over.
Cheers. Good everyone. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Portdown te Puke, ko the Solent te Moana, ko Ingarangi te Iwi, no Portsmouth aho, ko Ben toku ingoa, kei tiakatanga putao Aotearoa aho e mahi ana, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So, my name's Ben, I am the National Sea Spurge Lead at Biosecurity New Zealand, and I'm here today to talk to you about an ongoing research project we're doing with Cawthron, where we are aiming to provide effective surveillance prioritization for sea spurge control in the future, enabling earlier detection of sea spurge sites. So, a bit of background about sea spurge. Sea spurge is a long-lived herbaceous plant, which is originally from around the Mediterranean. It can grow up to a metre tall, but it's usually between 20 and 70 centimetres. And suitable habitats for the plant are basically anywhere its roots can get a hold. So places like dunes, rocky shores, estuaries, that kind of thing. It produces many stems with tightly packed leaves that grow and then die off after they flower, which you can see in this top picture here. See some dead stems with flowers on them. And it can flower all year round in New Zealand under the right conditions. Each plant can produce large numbers of seeds. There's one here in my hand. They're about 5 millimetres in diameter. They're buoyant, and they can remain viable in salt water for up to 6 years, so they kind of float around.
How many years?
6. That's the number I'm using. In New Zealand, sea spurge is an unwanted organism under the Biosecurity Act, and we have a national sea spurge program to find and control it. The first sea spurge detection we had was at Aotea in Waikato in 2012, where it likely floated across from Australia. And since then, we found 46 more sites, which are shown roughly on this map. Obviously, the dots are a lot bigger than the actual sites, so they're approximate locations. In its native range, sea spurge doesn't flower in its first year, but in New Zealand, it can reach sexual maturity at about 4 months old and produce seeds at about 5 months old, which can then germinate year-round. So if we don't find the populations early, they can snowball out of control really fast. It's important to note at all of these sites plant numbers are dropping. Many of them haven't had plants for a little while, but because of the viability of the seeds being so long, we have a 10-year monitoring period before we declare elimination at a site. So they're all going to be on the map for a while, but plant numbers are dropping across the board. If we don't control sea spurge, it can cause serious damage to our ecosystems. It forms dense monocultures of thousands of plants per hectare, taking over the dunes and outcompeting native species. It also has toxic sap, which causes painful burns and painful temporary blindness. It's just a nasty plant, and we really don't want it here. So all of those sites on the previous slide, they're controlled through collaborative work between ourselves at Biosecurity New Zealand, Department of Conservation, regional councils, and local iwi whānau hapu groups. So it's a really collaborative program where we all work very closely together to find and eliminate sea spurge. Because the population can snowball so fast, the earlier we detect the populations, the better. So being able to prioritise our surveillance is a necessity. At the moment, we find sea spurge largely through a number of ways. Things like iNaturalist, we have a site pop up, we go, oh, that's weird, we go have a look. Members of the public, while they're out on the beach, can spot it, call the 800 number, the MPI number. Iwi environmental teams have found some sites, so the one that Craig mentioned earlier at Spirits Bay, that was Ngāti Kuri's environmental team, were out and about in the dunes, they saw some sea spurge and they dealt with it. We also have DOC and regional council staff who are out on the dunes doing other work that spot sea spurge and tell us about it. And there is some sea spurge program surveillance that we do in high priority regions of the coastline. As I mentioned earlier, all of our sites are under control, but our coastline is huge, and it's often remote, and we can't look everywhere. That would require way too much money, so yeah, we've got to know where to look. And how do we do that? At the moment, we kind of can't. We're sort of guessing. Before we can do it effectively, we need to answer a number of very important questions. The first of them is, how likely is seed arrival in New Zealand? Was that first site in Aotea in 2012, was that the only time sea spurge seed has made it from Australia? Or does it come all the time? We don't know. If it happens all the time, then we need to be really, really vigilant looking for sea spurge. But if it's only happened a couple of times, if we get rid of what we have, we can sort of maybe look a bit less frequently. We also need to know where on New Zealand's coastline seeds are most likely to arrive. If there's places that it doesn't arrive because of the way the ocean currents move things around, then we don't need to look there so often. But if there's a place it's going to arrive all the time, we need to check there all the time. Same deal for areas which are or are not suitable habitat for the plant. If it can't live there, we probably shouldn't spend our money looking there. But if it's really, really awesome, we should probably look there more often. It would also really help to know how seeds are moving around New Zealand in our coastal currents. This means that if there's sort of a hidden population that we haven't found yet that's producing a lot of seeds, if we can kind of trace how the populations have moved around New Zealand, we might be able to zero in on that and go look there and find a hidden population. We also need to know how the answer to those questions will change over time, because obviously currents aren't static, the climate's not static. There's no point putting a bunch of effort in to answer these questions once, and then next year we go, well, where do we look now? So to answer those questions, we've put together a research project with Cawthron, comprised of 3 parallel work streams that are kind of going on at the same time. The first one is some genetic testing and relatedness of sea spurge in New Zealand and Australia from our sites. The second one is some ocean connectivity modelling for sea spurge seed dispersal across the Tasman and around New Zealand. And the third one is environmental suitability modelling for where is best for sea spurge to establish. Now, we started this in November 2024, and we're expecting to finish in November 2026, so we've got a bit of time ahead of us. And I would like to point out that I'm not an expert on these things. I'm just here to share what Cawthron are doing. If you have any super technical questions I can't answer, just get in touch with me and I can pass them on, and Cawthron should be able to answer those for you. So, the first work stream. For the genetic testing and relatedness analysis, we have collected 197 sea spurge samples so far, and those are shown on this map, which Cawthron have very kindly provided me at the bottom here. You can see that we've got some really good coverage of Australian sea spurge sources, including Lord Howe Island, which is awesome, and then we've got some from New Zealand. We have 57 fresh samples from New Zealand sea spurge sites, 119 samples preserved from various Australian herbaria, and we have 21 preserved samples from the Allen Herbarium here in New Zealand. Some of the samples we got from the Allen Herbarium originally didn't produce high enough quality DNA for our analysis, so for those, MPI was able to provide fresh DNA for 6, and those are the third category there. Yeah, so we've got really great coverage of the seed sources, so this should be very, very useful analysis. At the moment, the Cawthron are doing some preliminary DNA extraction and high-throughput sequencing, and they've found over 1,000 potential markers, which is surprising and very, very useful. Sample sequencing will begin in earnest at the end of this month, and the results of that will be used to build some phylogenetic trees and geographic distribution maps of genetic groups of sea spurge populations across Australia and New Zealand. So this should tell us how many times sea spurge has arrived from Australia, if our resolution is high enough, and connectivity between Australian and New Zealand sea spurge populations, and kind of help us figure out how it's been moving around, how often it arrives, whether there's multiple incursions from Australia, or if it's just been the one time. So that's really exciting. On to work stream 2, ocean connectivity modelling, which is where I'm really out of my depth. So, Cawthron are modelling seed movement from Australian seed sources, so populations of sea spurge in Australia, through to the boundary of New Zealand's exclusive economic zone using the GLORIES model, which is a global hydrodynamic model for modelling ocean currents and movement. From there, the New Zealand hindcast will be used to simulate movement to our coast, because that will give us higher resolution. The model will simulate the continuous release of sea spurge seeds as buoyant passive drifters for a duration of 14 years to get robust results, because sea spurge seeds are viable for 6, so it should be long enough to get robust statistics. Cawthron will also model seed dispersal from existing New Zealand sites, so if there's seed dispersal from New Zealand sites, it should show us where they are likely to go. and investigate how further spread of sea spurge around Australia and New Zealand would impact the results and change where sea spurge is more or less likely to arrive on New Zealand's coastlines. So it should give us a bit of future-proofing as well. I've already said this, the outputs from this modelling. So, yeah, they'll help us identify the areas of New Zealand's coastline that sea spurge seed is most likely to arrive based on those ocean currents, determine how likely sea spurge seed is to arrive. So if we release 100,000 seeds, how many of them are likely to arrive in New Zealand? Is it 1, 10, 1,000? It'll help us find out how seeds could be moving around New Zealand if they're released from New Zealand populations or if they enter our coastal currents and move elsewhere, and understand how this should change over time. The third work stream is environmental suitability modelling, which they're using MaxEnt, which is the current leading climate suitability machine learning algorithm, to predict sea spurge habitat suitability across New Zealand's coastline. We're going to train the model. At the moment, they're training the model using selected environmental variables in conjunction with occurrence data and background points. So the environmental variables are things that are important to sea spurge survival and establishment in a location, things like the annual temperature average, annual rainfall, soil clay content, and a number of other things, like I think human footprint, so how much the area is impacted by humans. And they have obtained data for the places that sea spurge is, which is the occurrence data, and the places where sea spurge isn't but could be. So the background points are places within sea spurge's range that sea spurge hasn't been found, which suggests that maybe it's not suitable for sea spurge establishment there. And so we have the environmental variables from where sea spurge is and isn't, and that will be used to produce a GIS layer mapping habitat suitability for sea spurge in New Zealand. On the right here is a very preliminary result from some of this training. A higher score, so a darker colour, shows more suitable for sea spurge, and you can see that it kind of maps to where our sea spurge sites are. So that's encouraging. It kind of says that places most suitable for sea spurge where we already have it, but it could also be because we're training the model on the occurrence data, so that's where it is, that's where it's best. So that's likely to change over time. Right. So at the end of this project, we're hoping to get 4 key outputs. The first is a relatedness tree for New Zealand sea spurge populations, how they're related to each other, connectivity between them, including their relationship to Australian sea spurge seed sources. So that should show us how things have moved around, how sea spurge has arrived in New Zealand, how many times it has, and movement. The second one is what I'm really excited about for my operational work, a GIS layer that enables prioritization of sea spurge surveillance areas. And it'll do this by showing a relative risk score of sea spurge incursion and establishment in coastal areas around New Zealand. And they'll produce that relative risk score by combining the likelihood of seed arrival from the ocean connectivity modelling and the likelihood of sea spurge establishment from the environmental suitability modelling into an overall risk score relative to the rest of the coastline. And that should let us find the areas of coastline that's most important for us to search and more often, and the areas that maybe we can visit a bit less often. The third and fourth outputs are a simply used framework for modelling seed dispersal across the Tasman that can be used for species other than sea spurge in the future, and an online ocean connectivity tool that can also be used for other species that are potentially coming from Australia to New Zealand. So these will be available online, in theory to the public, but as that's always subject to change, right? As much as we want things to be public, sometimes it's just, we can't do it. But it'll have instructions, and it should be usable for other species as long as they are passive buoyant drifters, so similar to sea spurge seeds, but they could have different release locations, different release numbers, different lengths of viability of those seeds. I mean, you could use it for things that aren't seeds, like, I don't know, if a ship sinks and releases a bunch of Coke cans, you could see where they'd arrive, something like that. But it should be really, really useful going forwards, and it will let us rerun these simulations in the future as things and variables change over time to keep the results current. That's the end. So I just want to say thanks, obviously, to Biosecurity New Zealand API for supporting me to talk here, and to Cawthron for being awesome, just providing me with some lovely pictures and just generally answering all of my stupid questions. Does anyone have any questions for me? Yes?
I'm just curious, just going back to your data, did it say that the last year's data, 2024, there was like 20 sites found out of 40?
Yes, which sounds scary but isn't. It's actually great because we found them now. And a lot of them are quite small.
Another question that's like a result of that. I guess if that's good, the trend is
We would assess that at the time based on resources available. At the moment, we work really collaboratively because no one organisation has enough resource to do all of the work. So we rely very heavily on each other, and we work really collaboratively together to put together things like Craig mentioned this morning, the roll-up in Northland. That's funding from Northern Regional Council and DOC and MPI to put together a person to work on sea spurge in the region. And that's awesome because, I mean, I'm not from Northland. I don't know anyone there. It's, you know, rude for me to show up and tell people what to do. But, you know, someone that knows what they're doing, then we can work with them and it all becomes a lot smoother. Yeah, so we'd assess at the time. I will say that's quite unlikely at the moment because we're staying really well on top of it. Most sites that their last visit have had sort of less than 50 plants.
Thanks for your insight, Ben. What do you do, or what would I do if I was walking along the beach and I see something I think is sea spurge? Do I pull it out?
No, thank you. Good question. So what you would do is you take a number of photos of it, things that you think would be useful for identifying a plant, so of the whole plant, of any flowers that are present, things like the leaves, and you would call the 0800 number, the MPI hotline. Was it 0800 80 99 66? Thanks. And you would report that through, and then I'd get an email, and then I'd ask someone at the regional councils or DOC, whoever's best placed. They'd go have a look, and then we'd remove it or not. Because there are a number of plants that look quite a lot like sea spurge, and we don't want people pulling them out because they're threatened, and also sea spurge can hurt you if you do it wrong. It's unlikely, but we don't want that one. We don't want that.
Would alerts through iNaturalist from the public come through?
I do check those, yeah. Yep, I check those. It's less of a formal process, but I kind of keep an eye on them, yeah. Yes?
For your max and habitat modeling, was that trained on both Australian and New Zealand data, or just New Zealand data?
I believe Australian and New Zealand data, but that would be one that I would double check with Cawthorne. Potentially international, but I think we cut it down to the Australasian range because otherwise it's way too much data. Yeah. Yes?
Has there been any thought around localised modelling? You know, you have, like, for instance, in Auckland, we had one instance of it in Pontypridd Scientific Reserve. It's a 1,500 hectares. Wetland, one adult, some juveniles, and we couldn't find any others. I'm just wondering if there's been any thought around how we would identify additional locations within some quite hard sites to survey.
So no, I think the resolution for this modelling is quite high, so I think they're about 1 kilometre stretches of coastline at the end. That one will be used as a seed source for the modelling, so we should be able to see where seed is likely to go from there, if you know what I mean. It's something that we could consider in the future if we keep finding things.
I assume it would be some sort of aeolian modelling as opposed to...
I don't know. Sorry, that's one that we could ask Cawthorne.
So he's been saved by the bell anyway. Ben's been a little bit of a sucker, and his speech was only about 13 minutes long, so he's given you plenty of chance for questions. But next up is Tanya. Thank you, Ben.